From the New Arts and Media Studios in Milwaukee, I'm Charles Purcell. This is The Log. Last night, I saw a really good segment on PBS NewsHour about a new report called Educating for American Democracy. And they interviewed one of the authors of that report. I forgot. I didn't catch her name. I don't remember now. But I did do a little quick search, and took me to Harvard Magazine and a piece by Spencer Lee Lenfield. Let me read you just the first paragraph. Several months before the invasion of the United States Capitol threw the nation's seat of legislative power into peril, the Annenberg Public Policy Center's survey on civic knowledge found that barely half of American adults can name all three branches of government, and 20% cannot name any rights protected by the First Amendment. Remarkably, these figures constitute improvements on the results of the previous 15 years of this annual survey. Even more troubling, the separate World Values Survey has found that since the 1950s, ever fewer numbers within each birth cohort in the United States has ranked it essential to live in a democratically governed country. Not even a third of Americans born in the 1980s think democracy is vital. This state of affairs follows prolonged disinvestment in the fields of history and civics. A new report reveals federal spending per pupil in these subjects averages 5 cents, whereas STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, per pupil averages $50, a 1,000-fold difference in funding allocation. All right, let's go back and highlight a couple of these things. 20% of Americans cannot name any rights protected in the First Amendment, and that's up from previous studies. Barely half of American adults can name all three branches of government. Shall we take that little quiz right now? What are the three branches of government? Legislative, very good, and that's Congress, the House and the Senate. Executive, very good. That's the president and all the agencies. And then, of course, the judiciary, which includes the Supreme Court and all other federal courts. Very good. You are among the less than half of Americans that can name those three branches. Who was it recently? Oh, I forgot. It was a Congress member, I think. Was it Rand Paul who said that the House and the Senate were two separate branches of government? And that whether or not it's essential to live in a democracy, that number has been falling. I think some people with a particular point of view might hear that statistic and automatically blame socialism. Because although it doesn't mention it here in this article, the favorability numbers for socialism have skyrocketed over those same years. But as I'm quick to point out, and I do every chance I get, when I say socialism, my definition includes democracy, real democracy, as a central defining characteristic. I mean, the Nazis of Germany called themselves socialists. You can call yourself anything you want. The communists of the Soviet Union called themselves socialists. So there are plenty of authoritarian states, anti-democratic states, that have used, abused, and defiled that word, socialism. So, speaking just for myself right now, I wouldn't shed any tears at all over the loss of the word socialism. I don't get married to words. But I am absolutely married. The ring is on the finger. I have made my lifelong commitment, unequivocal, unconditional, forever pledge to democracy, to small d democracy. And the fact that Americans over the years, more and more of them are deciding that democracy is something, we could do without. That's very troubling. I'm all for political diversity, different ideas, battling it out, fine, that's the way it works. But we all have to agree 100% that this country will be a democracy, and we will fight for that. That's the one common value, if there are any at all. That's the one common value we all have to share, every last one of us. You and I have talked about this before. The right-wingers are very quick to point out, oh, we don't live in a democracy. This is a republic. They just are really anxious to school you on that little history lesson. But of course, they entirely misunderstand the intention of the Founding Fathers. They certainly gave us a republic, a democratic republic. And a republic, by definition, is one where political office holders represent the citizens. But every bit as essential to the process is that citizens hold those representatives accountable, that they vote them into office democratically. So the right-wingers who want to give a bad name to democracy, they define democracy by mob rule. They try to present democracy in the very worst light possible. As soon as you get 51%, the other 49 can go hang themselves. They can face every injustice without recourse. We get 1 over 50, we win, you're gone. No soup for you. Well, we don't want that. Nobody wants that. We don't want to strip every right and privilege away from 49% of the population. Nobody wants that. I know I don't. And that's the very reason for this elaborate system of checks and balances. The very reason for the Bill of Rights, the concept of individual rights, that even 99% of the people can't take away from you. It's this intricate balance, this constant tension that's natural in a democratic republic, like this is supposed to be. And so many of us, most of us, a lot of us don't understand the basics of the country, of history, of civics. Reflected in that number, I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was this bad. This was shocking to me. 1 nickel, 1 damn wooden nickel per student spent on civics and history for every $50 spent on STEM. And those numbers are just eye-popping to me. I knew they were bad, but I had no idea. I had no idea. People have got it in their heads, and this is just the toughest thing to convince people about. We were talking about this recently. The purpose of education is not to train students for jobs. I don't know how people got that into their heads, that you go to school to learn how to be a worker. That is exactly wrong. You go to school, especially K through at least 14, to learn how the world works and your place in it. And that, of course, includes the basics of science and history and mathematics. Just how to function in the world, how to be a person. A great deal of that ought to be about the country and the world you live in. So certainly history and civics of this nation. But also world geography, world history. I'd love to see more comparative religion and philosophy. For better or worse, and I'd say for worse, religion is a huge force on this planet, and especially in this country. And for a student to get out of the 12th grade, or to get out of the first couple of years of college, or a full 4-year college experience, and know nothing about comparative religions, is to me unacceptable. It's crazy. So I am all for teaching religions, plural, in schools. Not advocating for them, of course. Not saying one's better than another. Not even saying that any of them are true at all. But we really ought to know. We really ought to know what these millions of people are up to, don't you think? If we want to live in a democracy, we ought to go into the voting booth with some clear idea of what it all means. And when the time is appropriate, when there are issues that require immediate need, you really ought to know how to advocate for yourself and for others. Talk to your representatives, write phone calls, hit the streets for protest, to peaceably assemble, to be an active citizen. This is what every single kid needs to learn. Every one of them, regardless of their particular aptitude or interests. One of them is going to be a musician, another one's going to be a scientist, another one's going to be a doctor, another one's going to be a teacher, another one's going to be a factory worker. Great. Everybody just go where you need to go, where you want to go, where your aptitude takes you. But every blessed last one of them should not get out of school without a really comprehensive, excellent understanding of how this country works, about each individual person's role in how the country works, in how we got here, i.e. history, how the country relates to the rest of the planet, world history, world geography, world civics. This is not asking too much. This is really basic stuff. Now, as for STEM, currently spending $50 per student versus 1 nickel on everything else. I'm not opposed to STEM, but I think the role of public school, K through 12 especially, and I would add the first couple years of college to that, introductory courses, certainly in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, of course. Outside of the core required curriculum, opportunities for electives that you can advance a little further in all of these areas. Yes, of course. But as for mid-level and advanced learning in STEM areas, I would not favor putting any of that into core curriculum, K through 14. No, I would not. Make it available for those interested to follow particular paths, absolutely. Especially as you move toward graduation from a bachelor's degree and you really want to start specializing your last couple of years, sure. By all means, make it available. Allow students to pursue their dreams. But 2 things. 1, it should not be part of the core curriculum. Every student shouldn't be expected to go down these paths. And 2, whatever extra learning has to be done to perform the particular skills of a profession, well, it's the responsibility of those industries to pony up and do the training there. That's always seemed a little crazy to me, that publicly funded education, public schools, colleges and universities should fund the training for private industries. That's never made any sense to me. Now, a couple things I haven't mentioned, and we talked about this, I think it was just a couple weeks ago, a lot about the humanities. Literature, philosophy, the creative arts, music, theater. They need a hell of a lot more respect in the public school curriculum, right throughout the entire K through 12 experience, K through 14. They are absolutely vital. They are essential to create whole persons who will live in the world and have some empathy for the other people around them, the people they share the country with, the people they share the planet with. So I'm a huge supporter of the humanities, especially in the public school curriculum. You build a nice foundation in those areas, you are building whole persons. And yes, I'll repeat as I have in the past, just to be clear, uneducated people can be fine, upstanding, moral, beautiful people. To use kind of a familiar framework here, to be unschooled in the finer things, arts, literature, humanities, philosophy, history, doesn't automatically make you a bad person. Doesn't make you mean or selfish. Doesn't make you a bigot. The lack of this kind of education doesn't automatically mean you're a deplorable. But if you are a deplorable, if you are a bigot, if you do turn out to be an insensitive jerk, a selfish moron who abuses the planet and abuses other people, there's a really very excellent chance you could have avoided that fate by the kind of education I'm talking about. So the lack of the kind of education I'm advocating for doesn't make you that bad person. But if we universally embrace the kind of education I'm advocating, we will have far, far fewer deplorables. I'm convinced of that. And then I'll add one thing I haven't mentioned yet that has become absolutely essential, and that is media literacy. Now, just through osmosis, pretty much every kid gets out of school perfectly capable of manipulating media. They can find what they want, they can create what they want, they can move around the media landscape like a pro, just because it's the water they swim in. But what many of them cannot do is employ critical thinking in order to discern the manipulative propaganda that's being pitched at them on every corner and the quality information they need to function in the digital landscape. So building that skill, building those muscles of discernment really needs to be central core curriculum, K through 14. Now, you might be saying after all this that I'm expecting an awful lot of the schools. Yes, but there's nothing they can't do. They can do all of this quite easily with support. Certainly, we're not asking too much of the students. They're absolutely capable of absorbing everything I've described. What students are capable of compared to what they're presented with in public education, I think there's a wide, wide gap right now. So from the student's point of view, I have no worries at all that they can handle it. Not only can they handle it, they'll love it. They'll be enriched and fulfilled. It'll be exciting. Every day of school could be exciting in the kind of education I'm describing, especially if we incorporate more self-directed learning, more peer-to-peer learning, less emphasis or zero emphasis on testing and grades. I mean, there are structural, systemic, proven reforms. Then, of course, we have the teachers and the teachers' unions. I'm a huge supporter of teachers. I'm always defending them. I'm the first one to say that they're asked to do way too much. They're asked to do social work and to be nurses and doctors and protectors, and it's gotten totally out of hand what they're expected to do. Teachers ought to teach. And the kind of curriculum I'm suggesting, I think they would embrace and have no trouble with, certainly as long as they don't have these added expectations, these added demands. If I were head of the teachers' union, that would be my primary focus. I mean, obviously, the traditional role of a union is to advocate for their members, and salaries and conditions are always right on top. And yes, we want good wages for teachers, obviously. But the added societal expectations, I'd be getting up every day and fighting against all of that. And then that brings us to the next level. Now we're into government. Now we're into school boards, state school boards, and federal education policy. Now they can really make a difference with support, with funding, with staffing, more support to parents so they can meet their responsibilities and not just pawn them off on the teachers, because we want every parent out in the workforce padding the bottom line of corporate America. Another story, but obviously central to any story we tell. So without going down that road right now, just suffice to say, parents should be free to be parents. The expectation that two parents, that both of them should be expected, each of them should be expected to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week is ludicrous. We need an economy that allows that family to choose for themselves. One spouse can work a full 40, the other can be a full-time caregiver. They can split 20-20, they can split 30-10. They can decide for themselves how they want to do it. But when it's an economic financial necessity for a family to have both parents occupied full-time outside the house, that's going to leave the kids wanting and forces teachers to fill roles they were never meant to fill. So you can't ever discuss education policy in a vacuum. You have to consider and you have to do something about the much larger national economic forces that are squeezing the educators. So city, state, federal policies have to be so much more supportive than they are now. If there's a story in the news about education, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be about cuts. Oh, difficult decisions. We have to cut here, we have to cut there. Always squeezing budgets. We have to completely reprioritize. There's a couple $100 billion waiting over in that bloated defense budget. There's several $100 billion also waiting for us in currently being occupied by corporate subsidies. It's not that we don't have the money. Don't ever let them tell you. Just please, do not ever fall for that we don't have the money. That's a lie. It's a lie. It's a lie. It's a lie. So, yeah, just with the right decisions, with the right allocation of funds and support, teachers could absolutely provide the kind of education I'm describing to their students. And students would eat it up. And I want to get back to this report I was originally talking about, Educating for American Democracy. But first, let me just mention one other thing. The way we teach kids currently is still kind of an experiment. We haven't been doing this very long. couple of 100 years at most. Really, the modern school, as we all know it, is younger than that. It's a relatively new institution. In my time in graduate school for education and in my short time teaching, I was centrally aware of this fact, that methods and methodologies have changed over the years, and there are always new ideas, there are new implementations. We're kind of figuring this thing out as we go along. It's much easier to learn what doesn't work than to learn what works, so we keep tinkering. But we know pretty clearly what doesn't work. Sadly, we continue to do it. Kids sitting at desks in straight rows with the one teacher in front of them as the expert. Rote learning, memorization, tests, names and dates. So much about education we know doesn't work. And so many places continue to do it. When I was in grad school, the big buzzword was interdisciplinary, integrated learning, so that teachers in different disciplines team up. The music teacher with the math teacher, for a kind of obvious example. Visual art, another obvious component that could enter into almost any other subject. We all do it when we're kids, right? We all do it in the early years. We draw pictures of the first Thanksgiving. We make turkeys out of tracing our hands. A little later, I remember myself when I was a kid, I always loved it in science when we'd have to draw the cell and color it in and label all the different components. Or geometry. Oh, the best of all these different shapes. A lot of drawing in geometry. This is my favorite area of math. After geometry, I got a little lost. Algebra and calculus. No, give me something I can draw. But interdisciplinary components to learning. We know this works. We know peer-to-peer works. We know that the elimination, or at least the reduction of grades and testing works. There are a lot of things we know. There's been a lot of experimenting in the last few decades about individual learning patterns, about mainstreaming special needs kids into the so-called regular classes. There have been some real hits and misses there, some well-intentioned experimenting, and it hasn't been easy. But I commend the efforts. So back to this report, Educating for American Democracy. I'm a big fan of this idea. I'm not afraid of teaching so-called controversial topics. This is the big fear, and one of the reasons that teachers and designers of curriculum stepped away from this is because parents just went nuts. You can't teach my kid about climate change when climate change isn't real. Oh, that's something we didn't talk about here this half hour yet. Yeah. Environmental sciences, climate crisis, absolutely central. But as this study points out, there's no reason at all that these subjects can't be taught in a fair way. And it's not this kind of silly both-sidism that the press falls prey to. No, it's basic information that everyone can agree on. That is that there are 3 branches of government and so on and so forth. And if and when it gets sticky, because we do have conservative parents and liberal parents, it's all in the presentation. The person I heard interviewed on PBS NewsHour last night really emphasizing the role of questions, open questions, allowing students to explore, for instance, the concept of fairness. Let's take a minute to define what fairness means. Have an open-ended discussion. We might very well hear the influence of family and parents, the conservatives, the liberals, the centrists, the whatever. As I often love to say on this program, there are bright, smart, beautiful people in this country. We got to let them loose. Let them do their thing. I don't have any fear at all that educators could handle this. But, as I described earlier, educators who are free to do their work, to use their skills as educators, not to stand up in front of a class of 40 kids and check off all the required boxes that have been mandated from on high. Let me read to you the key conclusions of the project. Schools should integrate the teaching of history and civics into a complementary curriculum, especially at the high school level. Civics should not take the form of a one semester and done requirement. States, districts, and teachers should shift from breadth to depth. Many state civics requirements read as long lists of facts and principles to be memorized. States should reconceive educational goals in terms of open-ended questions. Yeah, that's just what I was talking about. To stimulate analytical thinking rather than memorization. Instruction in all grades should not paper over disagreements on contentious civic issues, but rather teach how to cultivate civil disagreement and reflective patriotism in age-appropriate ways. So there again, you don't shy away from issues. You don't ignore them because they're controversial. Once again, you teach how to cultivate civil disagreement and reflective patriotism. And finally, all levels of government should work together to enlarge and continuously support the nation's core of history and civics teachers. The report proposes the ambitious goal of 1 million civics teachers by 2030, with robust mutual support networks and support from communities and states. University-level historians and political scientists should help put high-quality recent research into the hands of school teachers. So I think this is a fantastic report. I think you should take a look at it. I'll share it on the Charles Purcell Facebook page. And maybe you could forward it to your representative. Say, hey, you know what? Take a look at this. See if you can put some of this into action. Because of all the problems this country faces, and we've got plenty, I don't believe this is just another to add to our list of problems. Nope, I think this is something we put at the very top of the list as a solution to all the other problems we have. We can't solve anything. Climate crisis, institutional racism, income inequalities, misogyny, all the LGBTQ phobias, militarism, crisis management when it comes to the next pandemic or hurricane or cyber attack or whatever it is. We got plenty of things to worry about. But none of them, not a one of them, can be addressed without a functioning democracy. And we cannot have a functioning democracy when half or more than half of the citizens of this country have no idea how it works, what their role is in a democracy. And with a little wider scope, back to my advocacy for the humanities, when so many of us don't have the exposure or the training in basic human decency and empathy, all of which are nurtured and sometimes literally made possible in the humanities. So I'm a big fan of education. I will always be its loudest advocate, and giving it a central priority doesn't push other priorities aside, just the opposite. It enables us to meet all the other challenges. So, there's your pep talk for education. And K through 16 should be free and available to everyone, needless to say. All right, go out and get yourself some learning. I love you. I'm Charles Purcell.